The Chicago wind was a physical assault, a blade of ice that cut through Ilara's thin coat and settled deep in her bones. She clutched her worn leather portfolio to her chest, a useless shield against the cold, and the three men who had cornered her in the alcove of a closed art gallery. Their suits were expensive, their laughter a wet, ugly sound that echoed in the deserted street, and their words were small, cruel stones meant to chip away at what little she had left. One of them, reeking of whiskey and entitlement, reached out to touch a loose strand of her hair, his smirk, a mask of casual predation. In that moment, the eviction notice in her pocket felt less like paper and more like a tombstone for a life she had tried so hard to build. Her dignity was a flickering candle, and their breath was a storm threatening to extinguish it completely. But the chill of their mockery was nothing compared to the silence that was about to fall, a silence that would redefine her entire world. What happened in the next 10 seconds would shatter her reality, and if you watch until the end, you will understand the impossible price of her survival. Subscribe now to follow her journey and tell us in the comments what you would have done in her place. Ilara, at 28, was an architect with no buildings to her name, only sketches filled with light and space, dreams that now seemed like a bitter joke. Her portfolio was her last bastion of identity, a testament to a talent the world had no time for, and she protected it not as a collection of drawings, but as the final, fragile piece of her own soul. Her world was a landscape of muted grays and oppressive silence, a stark contrast to the vibrant city that hummed with life just beyond her reach. She had learned the rhythm of invisibility, the quiet shuffle of her worn boots on the pavement, the art of taking up as little space as possible in public libraries, the hollow echo of her own stomach in the dead of night. The forces that held her captive were relentless and impersonal. The crushing weight of student debt, the callous indifference of landlords, and the ghost of a family that had faded into memory long ago. She existed in the margins, a silent observer of a world of warmth and power she could see through glass windows but never touch, a world that seemed designed to keep people like her out. This crushing reality had not extinguished the fire within her, however. It had forged it into a quiet, unyielding sense of justice. She saw the casual cruelty of the powerful everywhere, in the sneer of a wealthy patron to a waiter, in the dismissive wave of a hand from a corporate executive to a beggar. Her pain had not made her bitter. It had sharpened her empathy, creating a moral clarity that was both her greatest strength and her most profound vulnerability. She carried the memory of her father, a carpenter cheated out of his life savings by a contractor's lie, and that injustice fueled her quiet defiance. She believed in a world where integrity mattered, even if her own life was daily proof that it was a currency with no value. Her days were a ritual of quiet survival. She would spend hours at the Chicago Cultural Center, not just for the warmth, but to be near the architecture, to trace the lines of the Tiffany Dome with her eyes and imagine a world built on beauty instead of greed. She would nurse a single cup of coffee for hours in a small diner, sketching on napkins when her paper ran out, her focus so intense that she could block out the pitying glances of the staff. These small acts were her resistance, a way of insisting on her own humanity in a world that sought to erase it. The scent of old paper from her portfolio and the distant wail of a city siren were the soundtrack to her lonely existence, a constant reminder of all she had and all she had lost. The solitude was a constant companion, a heavy cloak she could never take off. It was in the empty space beside her on the bus, the way she spoke to no one for days at a time, the profound ache of having no one to call when the fear became unbearable. It was this isolation that made her a target, a lone figure, easy to corner, easy to dismiss. She had once dreamed of designing homes, places of safety and belonging, but now she had no home of her own. This deep, gnawing loneliness was a wound far deeper than poverty, a quiet terror that whispered to her in the darkest hours of the night, telling her that she could disappear from the world and no one would ever notice. As the men's laughter finally died in their throats, a new tension descended upon the street, heavier and colder than the wind. It was not a sound, but a presence, a shift in the very fabric of the night. A long, black sedan had glided to the curb, its engine, a barely audible hum that seemed to absorb all other noise. Its polished exterior reflected the streetlights in distorted, liquid streaks, like tears in the darkness. The back door opened, and a silhouette emerged, a figure cloaked in shadow and an aura of absolute authority. The air grew still, charged with a danger far more profound than the drunken taunts of three foolish men. For Ilara, the world stopped turning, holding its breath for a verdict she didn't know she was awaiting. Her day began not with sunlight, but with the shrill, unforgiving cry of a cheap digital alarm clock. The air in her small studio apartment was perpetually cold, a damp chill that seeped through the single-pane window and settled in her bones. She dressed in the semi-darkness, pulling on the stiff, black uniform of her job at the Sovereign, a high-end downtown restaurant. The fabric was coarse against her skin, a constant, abrasive reminder of her station. Every movement was a study in quiet efficiency, a ritual honed by exhaustion. She would make her bed with military precision, not out of a sense of order, but because it was the one small corner of the universe she could control. The smell of stale coffee and the distant groan of the city waking up were the only constants in her fragile world. The number 22 bus was a metal tube of shared desperation, its windows fogged with the breath of weary commuters. Ilara always found a spot by the window, her portfolio held tight on her lap like a shield. Outside, the grand architecture of Chicago slid by, glass towers that scraped the sky, limestone facades carved with elegant precision. She would trace their lines with her eyes, deconstructing them, rebuilding them in her mind with more light, more grace. It was a silent, secret act of rebellion. Inside the bus, however, she was just another face in the crowd, anonymous and invisible, her dreams a stark, painful contrast to the grimy reality reflected in the glass, a world away from the one she was forced to inhabit every single day. The Sovereign was a world of polished marble, hushed conversations, and the subtle clinking of expensive silverware. It was a theater of wealth, and Ilara was part of the unseen stage crew. Her role was to be pleasant, efficient, and above all, unnoticeable. She moved through the opulent dining room with a practiced grace, her expression a carefully constructed mask of polite neutrality. She saw the casual power in the flick of a wrist summoning a waiter, the easy arrogance of men who discussed million-dollar deals over $70 steaks. This place was a monument to the very system that was crushing her, and she had to smile and serve its architects, the bitter irony a constant, metallic taste in her mouth. Her manager, Mr. Davies, was a man whose authority was built on small, daily cruelties. He thrived on the power he held over his staff, his eyes always scanning for a hint of weakness or defiance. He would correct her posture in front of guests, his hand lingering a moment too long on her lower back, or publicly criticize a minor, imagined mistake, his voice a low sneer designed to humiliate. Ilara endured it with a stoicism that he mistook for submission. She would meet his gaze for a fraction of a second, her own eyes clear and steady, and in that silent exchange, a battle of wills was fought and lost by him every time. He could control her job, but he could not touch the core of her dignity. The pressure was not just at work. It followed her home in the form of letters with red, urgent text. The student loan debt was a mountain she could never hope to climb. Each payment a reminder of a future she had believed in, a promise now broken. Her mother would call from her small town, her voice a mixture of love and anxious disappointment, her questions about a real job and settling down, feeling like tiny sharp stones. Ilara would lie, painting a picture of progress and stability, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. Each lie was a small death, another crack in the foundation of who she was trying to be, isolating her further in her silent struggle. In the rare, quiet moments, she would retreat into the world that truly belonged to her. During her 30-minute break, she would sit in the cramped staff locker room, her portfolio open across her knees. She would sketch on napkins, on the back of receipts, her pencil flying across the cheap paper. She designed homes filled with sunlight, public spaces that invited community, structures built for people, not for profit. These drawings were more than just a hobby. They were a lifeline. They were proof that the woman in the black uniform was a temporary disguise, that beneath the exhaustion and the fear, the architect, the dreamer, was still alive, fighting to breathe. One evening, a young couple, clearly on a first date and overwhelmed by the prices, were treated with disdain by another server. Ilara watched as their quiet embarrassment deepened under the server's condescending gaze. Without a second thought, she intervened, taking over the table with a warm, genuine smile. She guided them through the menu, suggesting the most affordable yet elegant options, treating them with the same respect she would a visiting dignitary. It was a small act, a simple gesture of empathy, but in the rigid, hierarchical world of the sovereign, it was a transgression. She had chosen human decency over the unspoken rule of catering exclusively to the wealthy. Mr. Davies had seen the entire exchange. He waited until the end of her shift, calling her into his small, windowless office. The air was thick, with the scent of cheap cologne and stale power. He didn't yell. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which made his words cut even deeper. He spoke of quote, brand image, and clientele expectations, phrases that meant nothing and everything. He told her she lacked the proper sense of priority for a place like this. He wasn't firing her, not yet. Instead, he was cutting her shifts in half, a slow, deliberate starvation of her income. It was a punishment designed to break her spirit, to remind her of her place. The blow was quiet but devastating. Half the shifts meant half the income, which meant the eviction notice in her pocket was no longer a threat, but a countdown to a final, inescapable deadline. She walked out of the restaurant and into the biting Chicago wind, the weight of her portfolio suddenly unbearable. The city lights, once a source of inspiration, now seemed to mock her, their brilliance illuminating a world she would never be a part of. She had no one to call, nowhere to go. The fight had drained out of her, replaced by a hollow, terrifying emptiness. She was adrift, a ghost in a city that had no room for her. She found a moment's respite in the stone alcove of a closed art gallery, the marble cold against her back. It was a space between spaces, a crack in the indifferent facade of the city. She huddled there, trying to shield her drawings, the last remnants of her soul, from the relentless wind. It was in this moment of absolute vulnerability, when she felt most invisible, that the world finally took notice. The sound of a steakhouse door opening nearby, followed by the wet, ugly laughter of three men, was the overture to the end of her old life. The oppression was no longer a silent, crushing weight. It was about to become terrifyingly real. The man who stepped out of the black sedan was not a man. He was a void. Dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the faint city light, he moved with a lethal grace that was a stark contradiction to his solid frame. His presence commanded a silence that was absolute, a vacuum that pulled in the noise of the street and extinguished it completely. The three men who had been tormenting Ilara froze, their drunken bravado evaporating like mist. They seemed to shrink in his shadow, their expensive suits suddenly looking cheap and ill-fitting. He didn't look at them, not at first. His gaze swept the street, a king surveying a territory he owned down to the last cobblestone, his authority an invisible, crushing force. Ilara felt it in her bones, a primal fear far deeper than what the other men had inspired. His name was Alessio Romano, a name spoken only in hushed, fearful whispers in the city's hidden corners, a ghost story told to frighten grown men. He was a legend built on silence and implication, a man whose power was so complete he had no need to display it. His face was a mask of cold, Italian marble, handsome, but devoid of warmth, carved by a life she could not begin to imagine. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, the only sign that time dared to affect him. He carried himself with an unnerving stillness, as if every muscle was coiled, ready to strike, yet held in perfect, disciplined control. His stillness was more menacing than any overt threat, a promise of violence held in elegant reserve. Without a word, Alessio's gaze finally settled on the three men. It was not a look of anger or aggression. It was something far colder, far more terrifying. It was a look of utter dismissal, the kind one gives to an insect before crushing it. It was a gaze that promised not just pain, but complete and total erasure from existence. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The men paled, their faces slack with a sudden sober terror. They stumbled backward, murmuring incoherent apologies to the air, to the sidewalk, to anyone but him. They turned and fled, their clumsy retreat a pathetic counterpoint to his statuesque calm, their fear a foul scent left hanging in the winter air. Then, that terrifying glacial stare fell upon Alara. The world narrowed to the space between them, the streetlights forming a halo around his imposing silhouette. She expected to see the same cold dismissal, the same contempt. But she didn't. For a fleeting, impossible second, the mask of the untouchable crime lord slipped. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, seemed to look past her threadbare coat and her shivering frame, past the fear that held her paralyzed. He was not looking at her, he was looking into her. He saw something there in the depths of her own gaze. Something she herself had forgotten she possessed. A core of unbroken, defiant steel. It was a silent recognition, a meeting of two souls from opposite ends of a moral universe. In her eyes, he saw an echo of a fire he had been forced to extinguish within himself decades ago, the raw, untamed integrity of a person not yet broken by the world's brutality. Her silent dignity in the face of humiliation was a language he understood intimately, a currency from a life he had long since abandoned. It was this recognition that destabilized him, a flicker of light penetrating his carefully constructed darkness. A subtle shift occurred in his expression, a crack in the marble facade, so minute that only someone under his intense scrutiny could have perceived it. It was a ghost of something that might have once been empathy, a forgotten muscle twitching back to life in the frozen landscape of his face. He took a step toward her, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the pavement. The movement was deliberate, fluid, and utterly confident. Alara flinched, her body braced for an impact, for a final, cruel blow. Instead, he stopped just before her, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from him, a stark contrast to the faint, clean scent of expensive wool and something else, something like winter and secrets. With an economy of motion that was almost hypnotic, he shrugged off his heavy cashmere overcoat. The gesture was slow, measured, and in the charged silence of the deserted street, it felt as monumental as the shifting of continents. He held it open for a moment, a dark, protective wing against the unforgiving night. He draped the coat over her shoulders. The weight of it was immediate and shocking, a heavy, comforting pressure that grounded her. The warmth sank through her thin clothes instantly, a profound and dizzying relief that was almost painful in its intensity. It was lined with silk, and it smelled of him, that subtle, clean scent of cold air and wealth and power. The garment swallowed her small frame, the sleeves hanging far past her hands. It was an absurdly intimate gesture, a claiming. Wrapped in his warmth, shielded by his power, Alara felt a tremor run through her that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a shudder of pure, terrifying confusion, a surrender to a force she could neither fight nor comprehend. When he finally spoke, his voice was nothing like she had expected. It was not the harsh growl of a brute, but a low, resonant baritone, as smooth and dark as aged whiskey. It held an absolute, unquestionable authority, the sound of a man who had never in his life had to repeat himself. Each word was carefully chosen, delivered with a precision that left no room for interpretation or argument. The sound vibrated through the heavy coat she wore, seeming to settle deep within her chest, a physical manifestation of his will. It was the calmest, most dangerous sound she had ever heard, a velvet glove hiding a fist of iron. She held her breath, waiting for the verdict. "Tonight, you will sleep in my bed." The words were not a proposition, not an invitation, and certainly not a question. They were a statement of fact, a declaration of what was to come, delivered with the same finality as a judge's sentence. The sentence hung in the frozen air between them, terrifying in its ambiguity. It was a rescue that felt like a capture, an act of protection that promised a deeper, more complex peril. Her immediate danger from the street thugs was gone, but it had been replaced by the far more profound and inescapable danger of this man, a man who had just thrown his world over her like a net. Ilara could only stare up at him, her mind a whirlwind of fear and a strange, unwelcome flicker of fascination. She was trapped not by his hands, but by the sheer, overwhelming force of his presence and the impossible weight of the coat on her shoulders. He did not wait for her to respond. The concept of her refusal did not seem to exist in his reality. He simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the waiting sedan, the open door a dark, beckoning mouth ready to swallow her whole. The echo of his command lingered in her ears, a quiet, undeniable rewriting of her entire existence. In that moment, she understood that her life was no longer her own. The world returned to her not with a jolt, but as a slow, silent tide. Ilara woke to the feel of impossibly soft sheets against her skin, and a silence so profound it had its own weight. She was alone in a vast, minimalist bedroom, where shades of charcoal and cream absorbed all light and sound. Her own worn clothes were gone, replaced by a simple silk robe laid neatly on a chair beside the bed. Beside it, her portfolio, unharmed. The air smelled of nothing and everything, clean, cold, and faintly of the man who had brought her here. She was in the heart of the beast, a gilded cage suspended high above the city, and the absence of bars only made the feeling of confinement more absolute. She was a guest, a prize, a prisoner, and she did not yet know which. He found her standing before the floor-to-ceiling window, a small, defiant figure in an oversized robe, staring down at the grid of city lights that now seemed so distant. Alessio stood in the doorway, a shadow in his own home, watching her. He had not slept. He had watched her breathe, a fragile rhythm in the crushing silence of his life, and felt the unwelcome stirring of something he had buried long ago. He said nothing, simply placed a tray with a steaming cup of coffee and a single pastry on a low table. It was not an offering of kindness, but a calculated gesture of control, a reminder that her most basic needs were now in his hands. He was studying her reaction, gauging her fear, her defiance, her resilience. Ilara turned, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, but she kept her gaze steady. She would not show him the terror that threatened to consume her. "I want to leave," she said, her voice surprisingly firm in the cavernous space. She expected resistance, a cold refusal, a quiet threat. Instead, Alessio gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "My driver will take you wherever you wish to go." The ease of his agreement was more disorienting than any argument. It was a dismissal. He had saved her, brought her into his sanctum, and was now releasing her as if she were a curious object he had finished examining. She felt a strange, sharp pang of something akin to disappointment, an emotion so illogical it frightened her more than he did. Life, however, refused to snap back into its old shape. The memory of his coat, of his voice, of the absolute power in his stillness, had imprinted itself onto her soul. She returned to her cold apartment to find the eviction notice gone from her door and a month's rent paid in full by an anonymous benefactor. The act was not a kindness. It was a brand, a mark of ownership that made her skin crawl. She tried to lose herself in the familiar anonymity of the city, seeking refuge in the public library's hushed halls, but she felt his presence everywhere. A black sedan, identical to his, would be parked for hours across the street. She would look up from a book and feel a gaze upon her, only to find no one there. He was an invisible net, closing in around her. He was testing her, she realized, but he was also testing himself. Alessio found himself drawn to the places she inhabited, these quiet pockets of a world he had long since left behind. He watched her from a distance, observing the way she treated a homeless man, with a quiet dignity that shamed the wealthy patrons she served at the restaurant. He saw the fierce concentration on her face as she sketched, her entire being poured onto the page. He was a man who moved pieces on a board of power and violence, but she was an architect of light and beauty. This contrast was a dissonant chord in the symphony of his controlled existence, a melody he found himself increasingly, dangerously, compelled to hear. The pull was undeniable, a gravitational force dragging his dark world toward her small, steady light. He fought it, retreating into the cold calculus of his business, reminding himself that sentiment was a weakness, a fatal flaw in his universe. But her image would intrude, the memory of her unbroken gaze, the fierce way she clutched her portfolio, the quiet strength that radiated from her like a low, steady hum. She was a question he could not answer, a vulnerability he could not afford. For the first time in decades, Alessio Romano, the man who controlled a city's underworld, felt a terrifying loss of control over the one territory he had always commanded with absolute authority, himself. One afternoon, as she sat sketching in a small park, he finally broke his silence. He approached her not as a predator, but as a quiet observer, his presence announced only by the subtle shift in the air around her. He did not sit beside her, but stood a respectful distance away, his hands in the pockets of his dark trousers. "The cantilever in your design for the lake house," he said, his voice a low murmur that didn't startle the pigeons at her feet. "It's ambitious, a statement of defiance against gravity." He had looked at her work. He had not just seen lines on paper. He had understood the intent, the dream behind them. The intimacy of his observation stole the air from her lungs. She looked up at him, her defenses momentarily shattered. He was not just a monster. He was a man of intelligence, of perception. This realization was far more dangerous than simple fear. "It's just a drawing," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a foundation," he countered softly, his stormy eyes holding hers. "Everything real begins as a drawing." In that moment, the chasm between their worlds seemed to shrink. He saw the architect in her, not the waitress, not the victim. He saw her soul, and in his gaze, she saw a flicker of a man who might have once built things instead of destroying them. The connection was terrifying, a fragile bridge built between two impossible shores. This strange, silent courtship continued in the spaces between their lives. He would appear at the restaurant, taking a secluded table in her section, always alone. He would order the most expensive wine and barely touch it, his attention fixed solely on her. He never made demands, never spoke more than a few necessary words, but his presence was a shield and a claim. The other staff gave her a wide, fearful berth. Mr. Davies, her leering manager, suddenly treated her with a nervous, almost fawning respect. Alessio's protection was a suffocating blanket, isolating her even as it kept her safe, pulling her deeper into a world she desperately wanted to escape. She began to see the cracks in his marble facade. She noticed the way his hand would clench for a moment when he thought no one was looking, a fleeting spasm of some deep, internal pain. She saw the profound weariness in his eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own, magnified 1,000 times over by the gilded emptiness of his life. She feared the crime lord, but she felt a dangerous, unwelcome empathy for the man. He was a paradox of lethal control and hidden wounds, and she found herself wanting to understand the origin of his scars, to know what kind of life could forge such a beautiful, terrible weapon of a man. For him, she was a mirror reflecting a version of himself he thought had died in a back alley in Sicily when he was just a boy. Her unwavering moral compass, her quiet insistence on dignity in a world that offered her none, was a constant, painful reminder of the choices he had made. He had chosen power over principle, survival over soul. Watching her was a form of self-flagellation, a penance he hadn't known he was seeking. He began to feel an unfamiliar, fiercely protective instinct, a desire not to possess her, but to preserve her. He wanted to keep her light from being extinguished by the very darkness he embodied. The tension between them became a living entity, a third presence in every silent encounter. It was in the way his gaze would linger on her face a second too long, in the way her breath would catch when he was near. Once, as he was leaving the restaurant, a clumsy busboy nearly collided with her, sending a tray of glasses crashing to the floor. Before she could react, Alessio's arm shot out, his hand wrapping around her waist to steady her, pulling her back against his chest. The contact was brief, a lightning strike of heat and solid strength through her thin uniform, but it left an imprint on her skin, a brand of forbidden warmth. The silence that followed was deafening. He let her go instantly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were dark with a storm of emotions she could not name. Fear, desire, and something else. A deep, aching regret. He turned and left without a word, but the encounter had changed the dynamic between them forever. The line had been crossed. The physical possibility of them, the sheer magnetic pull, was no longer a theoretical danger, but a palpable, undeniable reality. She could feel the ghost of his touch for hours, a burning reminder of the man who was both her protector and her greatest threat. The world he shielded her from, however, had a way of seeping through the cracks. Mr. Davies, emboldened by a few drinks after his shift, saw her waiting for the late-night bus. His newfound respect forgotten, his old resentment surfaced. "Think you're special now, don't you?" he sneered, backing her against the wall of the bus shelter. "Think your quiet little friend can protect you from everything?" His breath was sour, his proximity suffocating. Ilara froze, the familiar, paralyzing fear returning. But this time it was different. It was mixed with a cold, rising anger, a fury she hadn't known she possessed. Before she could act, a shadow detached itself from the alley across the street. It was not Alessio, but one of his men, a silent, imposing figure she had seen before, always in the periphery. The man didn't run. He walked with a calm, deliberate pace that was far more terrifying. He placed a heavy hand on Davis's shoulder, his grip like a vice. "Mr. Romano does not like it when his interests are disturbed," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I suggest you find a new city to work in, tonight." Davis's face went white, with a terror so profound it was almost comical. He stumbled away, disappearing into the night without a backward glance. The silent enforcer looked at Ilara, his expression impassive. He gave a slight nod, a gesture of mission accomplished, and then melted back into the shadows from which he came. She was left alone in the sudden, echoing silence, her heart pounding not with relief, but with a cold, horrifying clarity. This was Alessio's world. This was his protection. It was not a gentle shield. It was an invisible fist that reshaped her reality, that removed obstacles with a quiet, ruthless efficiency. He hadn't just saved her from a moment of harassment. He had erased a man from her life. She stood under the flickering fluorescent light of the bus shelter, the cold seeping into her bones, and understood the true nature of her dilemma. She was not just an object of his fascination. She was becoming a part of his world, a liability and a justification for his violence. His protection was a poison, a dark bargain she had never agreed to make. He was pulling her into his orbit, and the closer she got, the more the lines between right and wrong, between victim and accomplice, began to blur into an indistinguishable, terrifying gray. The choice was no longer about escaping him, but about who she would become if she stayed. The air in the Sovereign had grown thin and sharp, each breath a reminder of the invisible cage that had been built around Ilara's life. Alessio's protection was a constant, humming pressure, a shield that had become its own form of confinement. She could feel the stares of the other staff, a mixture of fear and resentment, and saw how the wealthy patrons now looked at her with a new, speculative curiosity. She was no longer just a waitress. She was an enigma, a territory marked by an unseen king. That fragile peace was shattered the moment Marco Vescovi walked through the door. He moved with a swaggering, predatory energy that was the antithesis of Alessio's controlled stillness. His smile a flash of white teeth and a handsome, cruel face. He was a different kind of monster, one who enjoyed the spectacle of suffering. Vescovi surveyed the room with the arrogance of a conquering general before his eyes landed on Ilara, a flicker of triumphant recognition in their depths. He bypassed the host stand and made his way directly to the secluded corner table that Alessio always occupied, a deliberate and profound act of desecration. His men, larger and cruder than Alessio's silent guardians, fanned out behind him. Vescovi settled into the chair, making a show of getting comfortable, before he raised a single finger and crooked it in Ilara's direction. A summons. The room held its collective breath. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear into the kitchen, but she knew there was no escape. With legs that felt like lead, she picked up a menu and walked toward the man who had just declared war. "So you're the little bird," Vescovi purred as she approached, his eyes roaming over her with a clinical, insulting appraisal. "I must admit, I don't see the appeal." But Romano always did have a taste for strays. He didn't look at the menu she offered. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing the back of her hand as he took it from her, the touch both casual and deeply invasive. "Tell me," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "what does a man who has everything see in a girl who has nothing?" His words were not a question, but a weapon, designed to strip her of her agency and reduce her to a mere possession, a curiosity he was intent on dissecting. A switch flipped inside Alara. It was not a conscious decision, but a primal, seismic shift. The years of silent endurance, of swallowing indignities, of making herself small to survive. All of it crumbled to dust. She pulled her hand back from his touch, the movement sharp and decisive. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she did not see a powerful man to be feared, but a pathetic bully hiding behind a facade of bravado. "He sees a woman who isn't for sale," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the resonant clarity of a struck bell. "And you, Mr. Vescovy, see nothing but price tags." The transgression was absolute. She had not only spoken back, she had judged him, she had named his vulgarity, and she had done it in a room full of witnesses. Vescovy's charming smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure reptilian fury. The air crackled with imminent violence. He rose slowly from his chair, his large frame eclipsing the candlelight, casting her in his suffocating shadow. The patrons at nearby tables flinched, some looking away, others frozen in a state of morbid fascination. His men shifted, their hands moving instinctively toward the jackets of their suits. Ilara stood her ground, her heart a wild, hammering drum against her ribs. She had drawn her line in the sand, a final defense of her soul, and she knew with a chilling certainty that she was about to pay the price for it. She braced herself, her eyes locked on his, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her fear. He appeared as if summoned by the sheer force of the moment, a ghost of vengeance stepping through the restaurant's main entrance. Alessio. His presence was a wave of absolute cold that washed through the room, extinguishing the hot, volatile anger of his rival. He did not spare a single glance for Vescovy or his men. His entire being, every ounce of his formidable focus, was locked on Alara. He saw the defiance in her posture, the terror she refused to show, and the profound, reckless courage that had just signed her death warrant. In that instant, a lifetime of discipline, of emotional solitude and calculated control, shattered into a million pieces. The king was no longer playing chess. He was defending the last piece on the board he could not bear to lose. Ignoring his enemy completely, the ultimate act of disrespect in their world, Alessio walked directly to her. He moved with a fluid, lethal grace, parting the frozen sea of onlookers until he stood before her, his body a living shield. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek in a gesture of impossible tenderness. "Are you hurt?" he murmured, his voice a low, intimate rumble that was for her and her alone. The question was an earthquake. In a world where his will was absolute law, he was asking for her state, her feeling. He was not commanding, he was caring. He had just laid his heart bare on the field of battle, exposing his only vulnerability for all his enemies to see. Ilara stared up into his stormy eyes and saw it all laid bare. The brutal history that had forged his coldness, the profound loneliness of his throne, and the terrifying, desperate need to protect the one flicker of light in his world of darkness. This was not about power or possession. It was a sacrifice. He was willing to burn down his entire empire to keep her safe. A single hot tear traced a path down her cheek, not of fear, but of a devastating, heartbreaking understanding. She couldn't speak. She could only give the slightest of nods, a silent answer that sealed their fate. His touch was not a cage. It was an anchor, and she was holding on for dear life. Only then, after ensuring she was unharmed, did Alessio turn his head. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply met Vescovy's stunned gaze, and the look in his eyes was not one of cold fury, but of a patient, meticulous, and biblical promise of ruin. It was a gaze that spoke of razing cities, salting the earth, and erasing a man's name from history itself. "Go," Alessio said. The word was a whisper, but it carried the force of a landslide. It was not a suggestion or a command. It was a final, irrevocable judgment. Vescovi, his face pale and slick with a sudden sweat, understood. He had not just provoked a rival. He had witnessed the birth of a legend's obsession. He and his men backed away and fled into the night. The silence they left behind was a physical thing, a ringing, hollow void where the world used to be. The restaurant was a mausoleum, its patrons and staff frozen like statues in a forgotten city. Alessio did not release her. His hand remained on her cheek, his eyes still searching hers, the two of them the calm, solitary center of the wreckage. The invisible lines had been crossed, the unspoken rules shattered beyond repair. He had broken the code of his brutal world for her, and she had broken her own code of silent survival for him. They were no longer two separate souls from two different worlds. They were a single, impossible truth, bound together by a transgression that could never be undone. The ride back to her apartment was a journey through a vacuum. The plush leather of the sedan's interior seemed to absorb all sound, leaving only the whisper of tires on wet pavement and the frantic, silent beating of Alara's own heart. Alessio sat beside her but was a world away, his profile a rigid silhouette against the blur of passing city lights. He did not look at her, did not speak. The air between them was thick with the fallout of his transgression, a radioactive silence charged with danger, sacrifice, and the terrifying weight of unspoken promises. She could still feel the ghost of his hand on her cheek, a phantom warmth in the profound, consuming cold of his withdrawal. He had built a fortress around her for one explosive moment, and now he was sealing its gates, leaving her on the outside, alone with the consequences of his war. He walked her to the door of her building, the transition from his world of silent luxury to her world of peeling paint and dim lighting, a dizzying, brutal shift. He stopped under the flickering fluorescent bulb of the entryway, the harsh light carving new, deep shadows into his face. For a moment, she thought he would say something, offer an explanation, a reason. Instead, he simply looked at her, and in his stormy eyes, she saw the full, devastating cost of his actions. It was a look of profound finality, a surgical severing of the impossible bond they had forged. He was a king retreating to his dark, lonely throne, and he was doing it to keep the war from reaching her shores. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, turned, and walked back to the waiting car, disappearing as completely as he had first appeared. Back in her small, cold room, the silence was a physical blow. The space felt smaller, emptier, the familiar scent of old paper and coffee, now a hollow reminder of a life that no longer felt like her own. The ghost of his presence lingered everywhere, in the memory of his warmth, the echo of his low voice, the impossible weight of his protection. She ran a hand over her own cheek, where his thumb had stroked away her fear, and the gesture felt like touching a sacred, fading wound. She was safe. She knew that with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, but she had never felt more abandoned. He had pulled her from the fire only to leave her in a quiet, desolate landscape of ice. The solitude, a far more profound and aching pain than any physical threat had ever been. Days bled into a week, each one a perfect, unbroken stretch of silence. The black sedans that had once shadowed her periphery were gone. The strange, suffocating bubble of his protection had vanished, and its absence left her feeling raw and exposed, like a nerve ending scraped against the rough stone of the city. She would find herself scanning the street from her window, waiting for a sign, a glimpse of his imposing figure, a message that never came. She returned to work at the Sovereign, where the staff now treated her like a ghost, their fear replaced by a pitying curiosity. She was a story whose ending they couldn't guess, a queen deposed before she had ever been crowned, and the weight of their stares was a constant, heavy shroud. The autumn rain began to fall, a steady, gray curtain that seemed to wash all the color from the world. Alara spent hours by her window, watching the drops trace erratic paths down the glass, blurring the city into a watercolor of indistinct lights and shadows. The view mirrored the landscape of her own heart, a place where clarity had been washed away by a flood of conflicting emotions. The rain was a constant, melancholic rhythm, the ticking of a clock measuring the growing distance between their two worlds. She had touched a life of impossible power and hidden pain, and now, returned to her own, she felt like a visitor in a land she no longer recognized, a stranger to the simple, stark realities she had once called her own. Slowly, through the fog of loneliness and confusion, a new, hard clarity began to emerge. The pain did not lessen, but it transformed, sharpening from a dull ache into a focused point of understanding. His silence was not a rejection, it was a shield. His withdrawal was not abandonment. It was the only form of protection he could offer that would not ultimately destroy her. He was a creature of darkness, and to love a thing of light, he had to let it go, to keep it from being consumed by his own shadow. This realization was a quiet, devastating revelation. It did not heal the wound of his absence, but it gave her pain a new, profound dignity. He had not broken her. He had, in his own brutal way, set her free. In his penthouse, high above the rain-slicked city, Alessio stood before his own wall of glass, a king surveying a kingdom of shadows. The war with Vescovi had been swift, silent, and absolute. Fortunes were ruined, alliances shattered, careers ended with a single, untraceable phone call. There was no bloodshed, only the cold, precise dismantling of a rival's empire. It was a masterpiece of controlled violence, a reaffirmation of his power. Yet, there was no victory in it. He would stare down at the grid of lights where she lived, a tiny, anonymous spark in the vast darkness, and feel the full, crushing weight of his solitude. He had won the war, but in doing so, he had exiled himself from the only territory that had ever truly mattered. Ilara found her way back to the only place she had ever felt whole, her art. She unrolled her sketches, her hand tracing the familiar lines, but something fundamental had shifted within her. Her designs, once filled with an almost naive obsession with light and open spaces, began to change. They acquired depth, complexity, a new understanding of structure and shadow. She began to draw buildings that were not just beautiful, but resilient, structures that could withstand a storm, that acknowledged the darkness in order to better celebrate the light. Her pain, her fear, her impossible connection to him, it all poured onto the page, transforming from raw emotion into something tangible, powerful, and enduring. Her work was no longer a dream. It was a testament to her survival. One afternoon, a long, flat package arrived at her door, delivered by a nondescript courier with no return address. Inside, nestled in black tissue paper, was not a letter or a gift, but a set of professional-grade architectural pens, and a ream of the finest vellum drafting paper she had ever seen. There was no note. None was needed. It was a silent, profound acknowledgement. He was not sending money or jewels, things that would have felt like a payment or an insult. He was sending her tools. He was telling her, across the silent chasm that now separated them, that he still saw her. Not the waitress, not the victim, not his vulnerability, but the architect. It was the most intimate, heartbreakingly respectful gesture he could have possibly made. The silence stretched on, no longer an absence but a permanent state of being. The echo of what they had not said to each other was louder than any conversation she had ever had. Their story had not ended. It had simply paused, suspended in the vast, melancholic space between two worlds that could never truly merge. He remained a ghost in her city, a powerful, unseen force whose single act of transgression had irrevocably altered the foundation of her life. She was a memory he carried into his world of shadows, a flicker of light that proved both his capacity for redemption and the ultimate price he had to pay for it. The bond remained, an invisible, unbreakable thread pulled taut across a city that held them both captive in their separate solitudes. 2 years passed, a silent expanse of time that reshaped the landscape of Ilara's world. The city had a new landmark, not a monument of cold steel and glass, but a small, intricate public library nestled in a once-forgotten neighborhood. It was her first realized project, a structure of warm wood and soaring windows that seemed to breathe light into the community. On the day of its public dedication, she stood before the assembled crowd, her voice clear and steady as she spoke not of concrete and cantilevers, but of creating spaces of dignity, safety, and quiet hope. She was no longer the shivering girl in the alcove, but a woman forged in a quiet fire, her confidence as solid and real as the building that stood behind her, a testament to a dream that had refused to die in the deepest, coldest winter. As the formal applause subsided and the doors were opened to the public, Ilara's gaze drifted toward the periphery of the celebration. She felt a familiar pull, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that her soul recognized before her mind could. There, standing partially obscured by the shadow of an old oak tree across the street, was a figure. He was unmistakable, a silhouette of darkness against the bright autumn day, clad in a perfectly tailored dark suit. It was Alessio. He was not looking at her, but at the library. He watched as children ran laughing through the entrance, as an elderly man settled onto a bench in the sunlit reading garden, as her vision came to vibrant human life. His face was an unreadable mask, but his stillness was different, not coiled with violence, but imbued with a profound, quiet reverence. He had not aged, but the years had settled a new kind of weight upon him, a weariness that went beyond the burdens of his violent empire. He was a king observing a world he could never enter, a ghost haunting the edges of a life he had helped save. He had protected her light not to possess it, but so it could shine on others, and in this moment, he was witnessing the full, breathtaking consequence of that single transgressive choice. This library, this sanctuary of knowledge and peace, was his silent penance and her public triumph. It was a structure built not only on her talent but on the foundation of his violent, unspoken sacrifice. He saw the goodness he had enabled, a form of redemption far more potent than any confession, a legacy of beauty born from his own darkness. Their eyes finally met across the distance. The crowd, the celebratory noise, the city itself all faded into an indistinct blur, leaving only the two of them suspended in a silent, charged space. There was no fear in her gaze now, only a deep, quiet understanding and a strength he had never seen before. She offered him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, of gratitude, and of forgiveness. It was a release. It told him that his sacrifice was not in vain, that she understood its true cost, and that she had built something beautiful from the wreckage of their shared past. He returned the nod, a single, sharp movement of his head, and in that simple, silent exchange, an entire universe of unspoken words was finally conveyed. He turned and walked away, his figure dissolving back into the anonymous flow of the city from which he came, leaving her standing in the warm light of her creation. She did not watch him go. She turned her attention back to the library, to the life humming within its walls, to the future she had built with her own two hands. The invisible thread that had once bound them in fear and fascination had not been severed, but had transformed. It was now a line of mutual respect, a bridge of memory between two souls who met in the dark and, for a brief, impossible moment, showed each other the light. She was finally whole without him, and he, perhaps for the first time, had found a sliver of peace in his own profound solitude. The redemption was not in a grand gesture, but in the quiet, enduring existence of this building, a place that held stories for everyone. He had saved an architect, and she, in turn, had created a sanctuary. Their story was a silent testament to the humanity that can bloom in the most barren of soils, a truth that echoes long after the final chapter closes. If their journey has moved you, if you believe in the possibility of light in the darkest of places, then share this story with someone who needs it. Let us know in the comments what true redemption means to you, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales that touch the soul. His world was violence, but his legacy, through her, became a quiet room filled with sunlight.